So what I thought I would do today is just sort of introduce myself to you all. I know that a lot of you are familiar with a lot of the work that I've done in the past, and since Chandra is now working with me and Charles Henderson, she's presented at group meeting and you know some of her work. So I just wanted to bring you up to speed for those of you who don't on the stuff that I've been doing, and also what I'm going to be doing in the future, and in particular places where there are lots of great student projects if you guys want to get involved. And I am now very excited to be from here.
So are we.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm so out of the loop, but I mean, I don't even know what you're doing here. So are you like on sabbatical or what?
No, hopefully I'm here permanently in a similar position to Kathy Perkins. So faculty, but not tenure track. Most of the work that I've done over the last 7 or 8 years has really focused on this issue that in our field there's a lot of really high quality curriculum development that's been going on, and that's all great, but no matter how good it actually is, if nobody adopts it and it doesn't get integrated into the mainstream, it's pretty much useless, even if it's really good. And so I'm really interested in, first of all, why it is so hard to get these really high-quality products out into the mainstream. And then also, of course, the big question, which is what can we do to help enable that a little bit better? Because I see in our communities there's such amazing work being done all around me, and so much of it, it just seems like it's not really getting out very well. So this is my interest, is how do we get that a little better? So I've been involved mainly with Charles Henderson, who's over there on the left, and then Chandra Turpin, who most of you know, she just graduated from here, joined us about a year ago and working on this line of projects. And what we've been doing is looking at physics faculty. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the studies, I'm just going to hit the highlights of it. But sort of the chronology of what we've done. We started with this little pilot project where we interviewed 5 faculty, which now seems really small. But at the time, we were like, wow, we got 5 interviews here to do something with. And we did actually manage to get 3 papers out of those 5 interviews that we did, which was amazing.
Should be a model for all of you graduate students.
We didn't have any funding at this point, which is part of why it was small scale. And we were both just out of grad school, so we were still trying to figure everything out. But we did these 5 interviews, and we also did a lot of reading of the research literature and trying to develop theories and mix those up in those papers that we did. And they were well received enough that about 7 applications later, we finally got funding. So don't get discouraged, because it did. I think we counted 7 times that we submitted and got rejected before we finally got funding. But we did finally get funding to follow up on this. And so what we did was do a survey that we sent out to a representative sample of physics faculty. We had 722 of them who responded with usable responses that we could analyze. And we asked all kinds of stuff. You know, their demographics. A lot of it was focused on what specific strategies from the PER field they knew about and were using, and how long they've been using them. And then just things like, you know, what general things do they do in class? How often do they have students discuss? What is the atmosphere in their department like? So we got all kinds of data from that. And as part of that same study, and this is the part where Chandra joined in and has been enormously helpful to us, we did 72 interviews. So of those 722, we interviewed 72 who had completed the survey. And they were people who had indicated, because peer instruction and workshop physics were 2 of the biggest things that people knew about and were using. Peer instruction being sort of the most traditional, and workshop physics being the most radical change that you might do. So we decided to interview people who said they're either using one of those 2 techniques, that they used to use one of those 2 techniques but they no longer do, or that they knew about the techniques but had decided not to use it. And we asked different questions to each of those groups to try to get at the issues that you might imagine they have. So we wanted to know, you know, how they learned about it, what they're actually doing in their classroom, how supportive their department was, all of this sort of thing. This analysis is still ongoing. It turns out it takes a lot longer to analyze 72 interviews than it did 5. So we're pretty much tanked in this at the moment. It's just amazing how long it takes. And now that there's 3 of us, of course, we get into lots of arguments about how to do the analysis, which is tedious and frustrating, but the impact is much better now that we've got 3 people involved. And then the new faculty workshop project. So the new faculty workshop is a workshop that's put on by the American Institute of Physics and APT combined. They bring in faculty who are in usually their first couple years of teaching, and they expose them to all of these great ideas from the education research community. And we know that this is actually pretty effective at getting people interested and wanting to try these things. So this project, which is just now started this fall, our plan is we identified 15 faculty who went through this workshop, and we're going to follow them for 5 semesters, so almost 3 years, interviewing them before and after their semester, catching them little pieces along the way, and just sort of see what happens to them over these 3 years. So we have some ideas about probably what's going to happen, and we want to document that as they struggle. I should say we picked the 15 who had indicated a lot of interest in really trying the stuff that they learned at the new faculty workshop. So this is sort of the best case scenario, right? I mean, these people know about the innovations. Their department sent them to the workshop, so they theoretically have some departmental support, and they're very enthusiastic. So like they got everything going for them, and if they can't integrate the stuff successfully, then anyone's going to have those kind of problems. So that's the idea, is to follow them. And then as follow-up, so this won't happen for a couple of years. Once we've sort of figured out what's going on from these interviews, we'll design another large-scale survey. So the opposite of this one. So this one here, we made a big survey and then focused down in the interviews. We're doing the opposite now. We're doing the interviews, and then from the interview data, we'll make a big survey to go in and sort of test the hypotheses that we get from the interview and see how applicable they are to the whole population. So that's a couple years away before we do the survey. So what do we find? I'm just going to hit on what I think are sort of some of the most important findings, more interesting findings. The biggest one, of course, is that this intuitive-based model of change doesn't work. And so you might say, well, what do I mean by the intuitive-based model? So it's the one that almost everybody uses. The idea is that you go out and you develop curriculum, and then you disseminate that curriculum along with lots of data that shows that it's better than whatever people were doing. Okay, and then you expect for change to happen. You wonder then why it didn't happen.
People are stupid.
And then you say things like, well, you know, change takes time, we just got to keep at it. Or you say, oh, stupid faculty, they like don't care, they're just interested in their research, they don't really want to do any of this. And then you keep repeating it and hope for different outcomes. So, you know, this one actually makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, but it just clearly doesn't work, right? It's been tried and tried, and it just doesn't work for all kinds of reasons. So we need to have a model of change that's actually research-based. Our field is very good about going in and doing research about how people learn and doing research on how effective is this curriculum, right? We're very research-intensive on that. But then when it comes to disseminating out those results, we don't do any research at all. We just assume we know what we're doing and throw it out and wonder why things didn't go very well. And so we really need that same attention in terms of research and data and theory building to ideas about how to bring about change that we do to developing the curriculum. And until we do, the curriculum is not going to get used, and it's not going to be as valuable as we might otherwise have it. So we don't have an answer to this question yet. This is sort of the ultimate question that we're working on, which is what kind of model of change would be effective. We do though have some ideas about it. So we have figured out things that the model would need to address. So one of the things that it needs to address is that somebody's action, what somebody actually does, is not entirely a result of their own personal beliefs and interest or knowledge, right? That person is put down in a particular environment, and so what happens to them is a result of their own personal characteristics, but also the environment that they're placed in. And we tend to ignore this environment. And I was quite happy actually come across this idea from the psychology literature. Turns out psychologists know this. They call it the fundamental attribution error. And what it is the tendency that people have a tendency to always attribute calls to individual characteristics, even when it's very clear that there are situational things involved. So like one of the studies that they did was, they showed people videos of people playing basketball, and one team was playing in the bright sunlight and they were making lots of baskets, and the other team was playing in near darkness and they were missing lots of baskets, and they asked people, okay, who's the better team? And everyone says, well, the team playing in the light. And they said, well, maybe their team's missing the baskets because they can't see it, but people don't really see that. They're like, no, they're not as good. So there's this tendency to always blame the individual and to ignore the structural component. And we have a tendency to do that as well. But when it comes to change and actually implementing things, those structures matter. The culture that instructors find themselves in, the room structure that they find themselves in, the time that they might be allowed to explore new ideas, the attitudes that the students bring into the classroom and their expectations, all of these things are going to influence what actually happens. So any sort of model of change has to account for that. It has to go in and identify what the structural, both affordances and barriers are. Sometimes structural things can be positive. Like when I was at NC State, Bob built up the scale-up room, which had all these round tables. Okay, and it was for interactive stuff in physics. But just like here, their classroom space is very prime, and so there was no way that that classroom could be completely dedicated to scale-up. So other people had to meet in that room. And what happened was that the people who met in the room simply by force started doing more interactive things, because they had round tables where students could talk. It wasn't their plan, it wasn't what they were going to do, but they found themselves in this room where students were sitting around, and so they started being more interactive. And these were like philosophy professors, it wasn't just physics. So sometimes environmental structures can encourage, oftentimes because they're all set up for traditional instruction, they tend to push faculty back in that traditional mode. So any kind of model needs to account for that. It's also been pretty clear, and this has come up in a number of different data sets that we've looked at, is that any model of change is going to have to fundamentally be based on the building of a community and the development of social connections with other people. So what we found is that when people do try more innovative things, it's never because they read a book or a journal article. It's because their friend told them about it. It's because they went to a workshop with the developer of the curriculum. They had some personal interaction that was what built that up. And if they then have a community around them of other people who are sharing in their endeavor that can support them and that they can work with and develop things with, they're much more likely to sustain that. So this has turned out to be something which is probably essential for any sort of model of change. Along those same lines, we tend to disseminate to faculty rather than working with them, and that doesn't work very well. The faculty get kind of upset about it, they don't feel respected, and then they kind of take whatever they're given and they go modify it anyway, and they tend to modify it in the direction of traditional instruction, so it doesn't work very well. So same thing along the line of community building. There needs to be community building among the adopters, but there also needs to be community building from the education community to the faculty, rather than this sort of top-down, I've developed it, here it is, now you go use it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, this is also, totally parallels another project for which Melissa and I are sort of in some Venn diagram, not overlapping, but Charles and I are, which is studying institutional practices, the other direction, on institutional change in STEM education that finds exactly the same things here, that it's institutions, when they engage in some of these things, don't account for individual actors on the one hand, or when people try and disseminate this out, they don't account for the institutional structures.